For most of my life, I believed sleep was simply a biological inconvenience. 8 hours every night, gone. 1/3 of existence spent unconscious, unproductive, vulnerable. I thought evolution had made a terrible mistake, leaving us defenseless for 8 hours daily while the world continued without us. But what I discovered 3 months ago changed everything I thought I knew about sleep, consciousness, and humanity's place in the universe. The truth wasn't revealed in a laboratory or university lecture hall. It came at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, when something impossible entered my bedroom and explained why those 8 hours aren't wasted time. They're the most critical hours of our existence. What this visitor revealed wasn't about dreams or rest or physical recovery. It was about a biological mechanism so sophisticated, so essential, that without it, humanity would have destroyed itself millennia ago. And we're only now beginning to understand what we've been doing every single night for our entire lives. If you want to discover what really happens during those 8 hours, what purpose sleep actually serves, and why skipping it might be far more dangerous than anyone realizes, subscribe to this channel and activate notifications. Because what you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you think about the 1/3 of your life you spend unconscious. Dr. Sarah Chen, 34 years old, neuroscience researcher at Stanford Sleep Laboratory, sat at her kitchen table at 2:47 a.m., staring at her laptop screen through exhausted eyes. The irony wasn't lost on her, a sleep researcher suffering from chronic insomnia for the past 6 weeks. It had started gradually. First, waking once per night. Then twice. Then lying awake for hours, mind racing despite physical exhaustion. She tried everything her field recommended: sleep hygiene protocols, cognitive behavioral therapy, melatonin supplements, even prescription medication. Nothing worked consistently. But Sarah's insomnia was different from typical cases. It wasn't anxiety-driven or stress-related. Her life was objectively stable: successful career, supportive partner, good health. The insomnia felt biological, as if her body had forgotten how to initiate sleep properly. More disturbing, her sleep architecture when measured in the lab showed bizarre patterns: REM cycles fragmenting unexpectedly, deep sleep stages abbreviated, and brainwave patterns she'd never seen in 15 years of research. Couldn't sleep again. Her partner Michael had appeared in the doorway, concern evident despite his own fatigue. Sarah closed her laptop. "It's like my brain refuses to shut down. Not racing thoughts exactly, but a persistent alertness, like waiting for something important that never arrives." Michael sat across from her. "You've been researching sleep for your entire career. If you can't fix this, something's fundamentally wrong." He was right. Sarah had helped hundreds of insomnia patients, published 17 peer-reviewed papers on sleep disorders, revolutionized understanding of circadian rhythms. But her own sleep dysfunction defied every framework she understood. What made it more troubling was the pattern she'd noticed in her research data over the past year. Sleep quality globally was deteriorating at an unprecedented rate. Not just insomnia cases increasing, but fundamental changes in how human brains were processing sleep. REM duration decreasing across all demographics. Deep sleep stages shortening. Sleep efficiency, the percentage of time in bed actually spent asleep, dropping by an average of 11% across industrialized nations in just 5 years. Her colleagues attributed it to modern lifestyle factors: blue light exposure, stress, caffeine consumption, irregular schedules. But Sarah suspected something deeper. The changes were too uniform, too systematic, occurring even in populations with minimal technology exposure. She'd spent the previous 3 weeks analyzing sleep data from 47 different countries, 230,000 subjects total, looking for patterns. And she'd found something that terrified her. Humanity was collectively losing the ability to achieve proper deep sleep. Not through behavioral choices, but through what appeared to be biological degradation. The most disturbing finding came from pediatric sleep studies. Children born in the last 10 years showed measurably different sleep architecture than children born 20 years ago. Their brains were processing sleep differently from birth, as if some fundamental mechanism had begun malfunctioning at a species level. Sarah had presented these findings to her department 3 days ago. The response was dismissive. Measurement error. one colleague suggested. Changing environmental factors, another proposed. Nobody wanted to consider the possibility she was implying, that human sleep itself was breaking down. That particular night, sitting in her kitchen at 2:47 a.m., Sarah made a decision. She would spend the night documenting her own sleep dysfunction with the portable EEG equipment from her lab. If her brain was doing something abnormal, she wanted data. She went upstairs, attached the electrodes to her scalp, a practiced routine from thousands of sleep studies, and lay down in bed. The equipment would record her brain waves, eye movements, muscle tension, everything necessary to map sleep architecture precisely. Sarah closed her eyes, expecting the usual hour of restless wakefulness before fragmented sleep. But something different happened. The bedroom atmosphere changed. Not dramatically, but unmistakably. The ambient temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. The quality of silence shifted from ordinary quiet to absolute stillness, as if sound itself had been suspended. Sarah's eyes opened, and she saw something impossible. A figure stood at the foot of her bed. Not human. Approximately 7 feet tall, impossibly slender proportions, skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The being was simultaneously present and not quite solid, like condensed shadow given form. Sarah's rational mind screamed hallucination, sleep deprivation psychosis, but the EEG electrodes on her scalp were recording. Whatever was happening, her brain activity was being measured in real time. The being didn't speak with sound. Information arrived directly in her consciousness, bypassing auditory processing entirely. Dr. Sarah Chen. Your perception is accurate. You are not hallucinating. I am present. And I have come to explain why your species is losing the ability to sleep properly, and what that loss means for humanity's survival. Sarah, trained in scientific methodology, responded with clinical precision despite terror flooding her nervous system. Identify yourself. State your purpose. Provide evidence this isn't a neurological event. The information transmitted was patient, almost teaching in tone. I am a biological monitor assigned to Earth by the Intergalactic Health Consortium. My species has observed humanity for 47,000 years, specifically monitoring your sleep mechanisms. And what I must tell you tonight is urgent. Human sleep serves a function your science has not yet discovered. A function critical to species survival. And that function is failing. Sarah sat up in bed, electrodes still attached, EEG equipment still recording. If this was a hallucination, it was the most coherent, information-dense psychotic episode in medical literature. Sleep function beyond physical restoration. Sarah's researcher instincts activated despite the impossibility of the situation. We've mapped sleep extensively, memory consolidation, immune function, metabolic regulation, toxin clearance through the glymphatic system. What function are we missing? The being moved closer, and Sarah noticed it didn't walk but rather space seemed to compress around it. Everything your science has discovered about sleep is correct but incomplete. Memory consolidation, physical restoration, immune regulation, these are beneficial side effects. The primary function is something your species doesn't consciously remember but your collective biology has been performing for 200,000 years. During sleep, specifically during the 8-hour window your species requires, your consciousness temporarily disconnects from this dimensional frequency and connects to a maintenance protocol established when humanity was first seeded on this planet. Sarah's scientific training demanded skepticism, but the being anticipated this. You are recording brain activity. Review your EEG data after this interaction. You will see patterns impossible under known neurological models. Consciousness maintaining coherence while brain waves indicate stage 3 sleep. This conversation is happening in a state your science hasn't categorized because it doesn't occur naturally. I am inducing it to ensure you remain conscious while I explain what your unconscious normally does. The being gestured, and Sarah's perception shifted. Not physically moving, but awareness expanding to encompass information that wasn't there before. 200,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens emerged as a distinct species, your biology was designed with a specific protocol. Every night, during deep sleep, Your consciousness uploads experimental data to a collective repository. Not metaphorical, a literal quantum database that stores the accumulated experiences of every human who has ever lived. This database serves two purposes. First, it maintains species-wide coherence, ensuring that humanity develops as an integrated civilization rather than fragmenting into incompatible genetic lineages. Second, it provides error correction for consciousness itself. Dreams are not random neural firing. They are processed experiences being integrated into the collective repository, and feedback being downloaded back to individual consciousness. Sarah processed this with the trained skepticism of 15 years in neuroscience. You're describing consciousness as software with nightly backup protocols. That's incompatible with materialist neuroscience. Your materialist framework is accurate for analyzing brain mechanics but insufficient for understanding consciousness architecture. The brain is hardware. Consciousness is software. And like all software, it requires maintenance protocols, error correction, and periodic updates to prevent systemic failures. Sleep is when those maintenance protocols run. 8 hours minimum because that's how long the full upload-download cycle requires. Less than 8 hours, and the protocol cannot complete. The consciousness accumulates errors. Fragmented memories, degraded emotional regulation, impaired decision-making. These aren't just tiredness side effects. They're evidence of incomplete maintenance cycles. The being transmitted information with increasing urgency. And here is the crisis. For the past 15 years, something has been interfering with this nightly upload protocol. Humanity's sleep is being disrupted not by behavioral factors but by quantum interference degrading the connection between individual consciousness and the collective repository. Sarah's researcher mind immediately sought mechanism. What's causing the interference? Your species' technological development. Specifically, electromagnetic radiation from digital infrastructure. Not the radiation itself. Your bodies have adapted to far more hostile environments. The problem is informational interference. Billions of devices broadcasting data signals create quantum noise that disrupts the subtle frequencies your consciousness uses during sleep to connect with the repository. Think of it like trying to make a phone call during a massive electromagnetic storm. The connection still exists, the protocol still tries to run, but interference corrupts the data transfer. Incomplete uploads mean experiences don't integrate properly into the collective. Incomplete downloads mean error correction feedback doesn't reach individual consciousness. The result is exactly what you've been documenting in your research: degraded sleep architecture, shorter REM cycles, abbreviated deep sleep, and most critically, reduced sleep efficiency. Not because bodies need less sleep, but because interference prevents the maintenance protocol from completing properly even when people try to sleep full 8-hour cycles. Sarah thought of her data, 230,000 subjects across 47 countries, all showing the same systematic degradation. How long until this interference makes the protocol completely non-functional? The being's response carried weight. At current degradation rates, 7 to 9 years. After that, the nightly upload-download cycle becomes so corrupted that it functionally ceases. Individual consciousnesses will remain isolated, unable to integrate with the collective repository. And that isolation has consequences your species has never experienced in its entire evolutionary history. Sarah stood from her bed, the EEG equipment trailing behind her like electronic tentacles. If this being was real, if this explanation was accurate, the implications rewrote everything neuroscience understood about sleep. This collective repository, describe its architecture. How does individual consciousness interface with it? What mechanism allows upload-download during unconsciousness? The being transmitted information in structured layers, as if recognizing Sarah's need for systematic understanding. The repository exists in quantum superposition, simultaneously everywhere and nowhere in physical space. When your brain enters stage 3 sleep, specific neural oscillation patterns create a quantum coherence window. During this window, information encoded in consciousness can transfer to the repository through quantum entanglement. The process is automatic, evolved over 200,000 years. You don't consciously direct it any more than you consciously direct heartbeat regulation. The brain achieves specific oscillation frequencies. The quantum window opens, upload begins. 8 hours minimum because transferring a full day's experimental data through quantum channels takes time. Approximately 4 to 5 hours. The remaining 3 to 4 hours allow for download and integration of collective feedback. Sarah's understanding of quantum biology was rudimentary, but she knew enough to recognize this wasn't pseudoscience. Quantum coherence in biological systems had been documented in photosynthesis, bird navigation, possibly even in microtubules within neurons. What kind of feedback does the collective repository provide to individual consciousness? Error correction primarily. Your species generates approximately 47 cognitive distortions daily, misinterpretations, emotional overreactions, flawed assumptions, incomplete pattern recognition. These errors compound over time if not corrected. During sleep, your individual experiences are checked against the collective repository's accumulated wisdom, 200,000 years of human experience, and corrections are downloaded back to your consciousness. This is why sleep improves problem-solving abilities. Not because the brain rests, but because you literally access solutions that worked for other humans facing similar problems throughout history. The repository identifies patterns in your daily experiences, matches them to historical precedents, and downloads relevant insights. It's also why sleep deprivation degrades decision-making so severely. Without nightly error correction, cognitive distortions accumulate exponentially. After 72 hours without proper sleep, your decision-making capability degrades to approximately 23% of baseline, not because you're tired, but because 72 hours of uncorrected cognitive errors have compounded into systematic judgment failure. Sarah thought of sleep deprivation studies she'd conducted. Subjects staying awake for extended periods showed decision-making degradation that seemed disproportionate to simple fatigue. This would explain why even one night of proper sleep can restore cognitive function after prolonged deprivation. Correct. One complete 8-hour upload-download cycle can clear accumulated errors and restore baseline cognitive function. The brain is remarkably resilient when the maintenance protocol runs properly. But chronic sleep disruption, weeks or months of incomplete cycles, creates error accumulation that becomes difficult to reverse even with extended recovery sleep. The being transmitted something more troubling. And here is what your species doesn't consciously know. The collective repository doesn't just store individual experiences. It maintains species-wide coherence. Shared values, ethical frameworks, emotional regulation norms, these aren't just cultural transmission. They're downloaded from the repository during sleep, ensuring that humanity develops as an integrated civilization despite geographical and cultural separation. Throughout your history, humans in completely isolated populations developed remarkably similar ethical codes, social structures, artistic expressions. Your anthropologists attribute this to universal human nature, which is partially correct. But the mechanism of that universal nature is nightly downloading from the collective repository. Isolated populations accessed the same database, received the same fundamental coherence protocols, and developed compatible civilizations. Sarah felt conceptual vertigo. You're describing humanity as a networked consciousness operating through distributed nodes, individual humans, all connected through a nightly synchronization protocol. That's precisely what you are. Not a collection of isolated individuals, but an integrated network consciousness that maintains coherence through nightly data exchange. And that network is breaking down because technological interference is corrupting the synchronization protocol. The degradation you've documented in your research, reduced sleep efficiency, fragmented REM cycles, abbreviated deep sleep, these are symptoms of network degradation. Individual nodes losing stable connection to the repository. And when enough nodes lose connection, the entire network's coherence begins collapsing. The being gestured again, and Sarah's perception expanded further. Not hallucination but enhanced sensory processing, allowing her to perceive patterns normally invisible. Observe what is happening to your species in real time. Sarah saw, not with her eyes but with direct consciousness, a vast network of light. Billions of nodes representing every sleeping human on Earth, connected by subtle threads to a central luminous structure, the collective repository. But the network was deteriorating. Threads fraying, connections flickering, entire sections going dark. This is humanity's collective consciousness network as it exists right now. Each bright node is a human achieving proper 8-hour sleep and maintaining stable repository connection. Dimmer nodes are experiencing degraded sleep, connection unstable but functional. Dark nodes have lost connection entirely, chronic insomnia, severe sleep disorders, or sleeping less than 5 hours with such heavy interference that no meaningful data transfer occurs. Sarah saw the pattern. Major population centers showed the darkest concentrations. Cities glowing with electromagnetic radiation from millions of devices, humanity's consciousness network barely visible beneath the interference. 15 years ago, 89% of humanity maintained stable repository connection during sleep. Today, that number is 71% and declining by approximately 1.3% annually. When it drops below 60%, projected within 7 years, network coherence collapses entirely. The repository will still exist, but too few nodes maintaining connection to sustain species-wide integration. The consequences will be catastrophic. Not dramatic or sudden, but inexorable. Humanity will fragment into incompatible consciousness clusters. Shared ethical frameworks will dissolve. Empathy between different populations will deteriorate because you'll no longer access the collective experiences that create understanding across cultural boundaries. Conflicts will intensify because error correction won't function. Cognitive distortions will compound without the repository providing corrective feedback. Sarah processed the implications. This would explain increasing polarization, declining empathy, rising extremism, not as political phenomena but as symptoms of consciousness network degradation. Exactly. Your sociologists and political scientists analyze these trends as cultural or economic problems. The root cause is biological, deteriorating sleep quality leading to repository disconnection, which fragmenting species-wide consciousness coherence. Politics is downstream of consciousness architecture. The being transmitted detailed data that Sarah's research mind absorbed eagerly despite the impossibility. Specific correlations. Populations averaging less than 6.5 hours sleep show 340% higher rates of extreme political polarization. Communities with highest electromagnetic interference show 280% higher rates of empathy degradation. Individuals with chronic sleep disorders show decision-making patterns increasingly divergent from historical human norms, not learning from collective wisdom because they're not receiving repository downloads. Your species is literally losing access to 200,000 years of accumulated wisdom. Each generation born into higher interference environments has weaker repository connection from birth. Children today dream less vividly than children 20 years ago because dream generation, the process of integrating repository downloads, requires stable connection quality they're not achieving. Sarah thought of her pediatric sleep data. Children born in the last decade showing fundamentally different sleep architecture. How do we reverse this? Reduce electromagnetic interference? That seems impossible given global technology dependence. Reversal doesn't require eliminating technology. It requires understanding the specific interference frequencies and filtering them. The bandwidth your consciousness uses for repository connection is extremely narrow. Electromagnetic radiation between 0.5 and 4 Hz during deep sleep stages. Most digital infrastructure operates far outside this range. The problem is specific devices and configurations that happen to generate noise in this exact frequency band. Certain Wi-Fi routers, specific cellular transmission protocols, particular LED light drivers, individually negligible, but billions of devices creating cumulative interference that corrupts the quantum coherence window. Solution is targeted. Identify interference sources in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band, modify their emission profiles, and repository connection quality improves dramatically. This doesn't require abandoning technology, just informed engineering modifications that your species has the capability to implement immediately. Sarah's scientific mind demanded specifics. Why exactly 8 hours? What happens during each phase of that duration? The being transmitted information with precision that suggested deep understanding of human neurobiology. The 8-hour requirement is dictated by data transfer bandwidth and consciousness processing speed. The protocol has 6 distinct phases that must complete sequentially. Phase 1, hours 0 to 1.5, consciousness detachment. Your brain transitions from waking beta waves through alpha and theta into delta oscillation. This creates initial quantum coherence. During this phase, your consciousness gradually releases attachment to daily identity and begins preparing for repository interface. Dreams in this phase are typically chaotic, processing immediate surface experiences. Phase 2, hours 1.5 to 3, primary upload. Deep sleep stage 3, maximum delta wave activity. Quantum coherence window fully open. Your day's experimental data uploads to repository. Memories, emotional responses, decisions made, problems encountered. Transfer bandwidth is limited by quantum channel capacity, which is why this requires 90 minutes minimum for a standard day's experiences. Phase 3, hours 3 to 4.5, repository processing. Your consciousness remains in deep sleep while the repository processes uploaded data. Experiences are indexed, compared against historical patterns, checked for cognitive errors, and prepared for feedback generation. This processing happens at quantum speeds but still requires approximately 90 minutes to complete thoroughly. Phase 4, hours 4.5 to 6, primary download. REM sleep initiates. Brain waves shift to theta and alpha. Downloaded feedback from repository begins integrating into consciousness. This manifests as vivid dreams, not random but organized narrative structures representing repository insights being encoded into accessible memory formats. Phase 5, hours 6 to 7.5, integration and error correction. Alternating between light sleep and brief REM cycles. Downloaded insights integrate with existing memory structures. Cognitive distortions accumulated during waking hours are corrected. Emotional responses are recalibrated. Decision-making frameworks are updated based on collective wisdom. Phase 6, hours 7.5-8+, consciousness reattachment. Brain activity gradually shifts back toward waking state. Theta, then alpha, then beta waves. Consciousness reattaches to daily identity, but now carrying integrated repository feedback. Final dreams in this phase often feel prophetic or insightful because they represent newly downloaded wisdom becoming accessible to waking consciousness. 8 hours minimum because each phase cannot be compressed without degrading function. Reducing sleep to 6 hours means phase 4 and 5 are abbreviated or eliminated. Repository feedback downloads incompletely or not at all. Your consciousness goes through the day operating on yesterday's uncorrected errors. Chronic 6-hour sleep creates exponential error accumulation. Week 1, minor degradation, slightly worse decisions, slightly lower empathy. Month 3, moderate degradation, noticeable emotional instability, impaired problem solving. Year 1, severe degradation, systematic judgment failures, inability to learn from mistakes, deteriorating relationships. Sarah thought of sleep restriction studies showing exactly these patterns. This explains why sleep debt can't be fully repaid with weekend catch-up sleep. Correct. Missing repository connection for 5 nights means 5 days of uncorrected cognitive errors compounding. 1 night of proper 8-hour sleep clears some accumulation, but not 5 days' worth. The repository can process immediate recent errors effectively but struggles to correct deep error chains that have been reinforcing each other for days. This is why chronic sleep deprivation creates personality changes that seem permanent. Not because sleep deprivation damages the brain, neuroplasticity can repair most physical degradation, but because months of accumulated cognitive errors create self-reinforcing distortion patterns. The person literally develops flawed thinking frameworks that feel normal because they've operated within them so long. Restoration requires not just resuming 8-hour sleep but conscious recognition that thinking patterns have been corrupted. The repository can download corrections, but if waking consciousness dismisses them as irrelevant, integration fails. This is why some chronic insomniacs who finally achieve proper sleep still show cognitive deficits. They resist integrating repository feedback because corrupted thinking patterns feel like their authentic self. The being transmitted something more personal. Your own 6-week insomnia, Dr. Chen, has already created measurable cognitive distortion. Not severe yet, but present. Your research conclusions are becoming more extreme, your interpersonal patience decreasing, your emotional responses slightly more volatile. Not dramatically, but anyone who knew you 6 months ago would notice subtle changes. Sarah felt defensive reaction rise, then recognized it. Exactly the kind of distorted response the being described. 6 weeks ago, she would have received criticism with scientific curiosity. Now, immediate defensiveness. Evidence of degrading emotional regulation. How do I restore proper sleep? If interference is corrupting my repository connection, what's the solution? For you specifically, acute intervention. I will provide a quantum coherence enhancer, a device that generates a localized field neutralizing electromagnetic interference in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band within a 3-meter radius. Place it near your bed, and your repository connection will restore to baseline quality within 3 nights of proper 8-hour sleep. But the device is temporary solution for you alone. The species-wide solution requires global awareness of the interference problem and systematic modification of emission profiles from billions of devices. That's why I'm contacting you specifically, Dr. Sarah Chen. You have the scientific credibility, research data, and communication platform to bring this to humanity's attention. Sarah's researcher instincts activated fully. Describe the upload mechanism in detail. How does experimental data encode into quantum states? What neural structures facilitate the transfer? The being seemed pleased by the precise questioning. The primary interface structure is the brain's default mode network, medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, lateral parietal regions. During waking consciousness, this network generates your sense of continuous self. During deep sleep, it shifts function from self-generation to data preparation. Experiences from the day, sensory inputs, emotional responses, cognitive decisions, exist as electrochemical patterns across distributed neural networks. During phase 2 sleep, the default mode network coordinates these patterns into coherent data packets. Think of it as compressing distributed files into a single upload stream. The actual quantum interface occurs at the microtubule level within neurons. Microtubules are protein structures that form the cell's cytoskeleton. Your neuroscience knows them primarily for structural functions, but they also operate as quantum coherence chambers. During specific oscillation frequencies, the delta waves of deep sleep, microtubules throughout the default mode network achieve synchronized quantum coherence. When this coherence is established, information encoded in microtubule quantum states can entangle with corresponding states in the repository. The entanglement allows information transfer that bypasses normal spacetime constraints. Data doesn't travel from your brain to the repository. Your brain's quantum states temporarily merge with the repository's quantum states, allowing direct information exchange. The process is elegant but requires precise conditions. Temperature must be within specific ranges. Too warm and thermal noise disrupts coherence. Electromagnetic environment must be clean. Interference in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band corrupts the coherence window. Neural oscillation must maintain stable delta frequency. Fragmented sleep means oscillation instability that prevents coherence establishment. This is why sleep quality matters more than sleep quantity for some functions. 7 hours of stable, uninterrupted deep sleep with clean electromagnetic environment provides better repository connection than 9 hours of fragmented sleep in high-interference environment. Quantity matters, but quality determines whether the upload-download protocol can actually complete. Sarah absorbed this with growing excitement. This is testable. Microtubule quantum coherence during sleep should produce measurable signatures. Specific quantum oscillation patterns in neurons during delta wave sleep. Correct, and these signatures have been measured but misinterpreted. Your sleep researchers have documented unusual electromagnetic patterns during deep sleep, weak but coherent signals that don't match known neural communication mechanisms. These are dismissed as measurement artifacts because current neuroscience models don't predict quantum coherence in sleeping brains. But the signals are real. They represent the quantum coherence window opening and repository connection establishing. Researchers recording them are literally detecting humanity's nightly consciousness upload process without recognizing what they're observing. The being transmitted data that made Sarah's scientific mind race. Specific testable predictions. Individuals with higher sleep quality will show stronger coherent electromagnetic signatures during stage 3 sleep. Individuals in electromagnetically shielded environments will show cleaner signature patterns than those sleeping near interference sources. Populations with better average sleep will show more synchronized signature timing. Evidence of coordinated repository access windows. All of this is measurable with existing equipment. The signatures are already in your sleep lab's data archives. You simply need to analyze them with the correct theoretical framework, looking for quantum coherence markers rather than classical neural communication patterns. Sarah thought of years of sleep recordings sitting in laboratory databases. If this is real, the evidence is already there, waiting for proper analysis. Yes. And here's what makes your specific role critical. You have the data, the credibility, and the communication platform. Publishing this research won't be easy. It contradicts materialist neuroscience paradigms. But the evidence is rigorous enough to withstand peer review if presented carefully. Start with correlation studies. Sleep quality versus electromagnetic interference levels. Deep sleep duration versus decision-making performance. Childhood sleep architecture changes versus environmental electromagnetic density. Build the empirical case before introducing the theoretical framework. Then introduce the quantum coherence model as a proposed mechanism explaining the correlations. Not claiming absolute proof, but presenting it as a testable hypothesis that predicts specific measurable outcomes. Other researchers will attempt to replicate. Some will confirm. Gradually, the evidence accumulates until the paradigm shifts. Sarah recognized the strategy, how controversial theories gain acceptance in science. How long until this becomes mainstream understanding? 5 to 8 years if you begin publishing immediately. 15 to 20 years if you delay. The critical factor is whether you act while the degradation is still reversible. If humanity's repository connection drops below 60% before the interference problem is widely recognized, restoring network coherence becomes exponentially more difficult. Species-wide consciousness fragmentation creates its own momentum. Populations with degraded repository connection make worse decisions, which create more problems, which generate more stress, which further degrades sleep quality, which accelerates fragmentation. Positive feedback loop toward collapse. But the loop can be interrupted. Modest improvements in sleep quality create modest decision-making improvements, which reduce stress, which enable better sleep, which accelerate repository reconnect ion. Positive feedback toward restoration. The key is initiating the reversal before fragmentation becomes self-sustaining. Sarah's curiosity deepened. This collective repository containing 200,000 years of human experience, can individuals consciously access it? Not just passive downloads during sleep, but active queries. The being transmitted information suggesting this was the question it had been waiting for. Yes, and humanity has been doing it throughout your history without recognizing the mechanism. What you call intuition, sudden insights, creative breakthroughs, prophetic dreams, these are all conscious repository access events. The protocol has 2 modes, automatic and query-initiated. Automatic mode runs every night during standard 8-hour sleep. Passive upload of daily experiences, passive download of error corrections and relevant insights. This maintains baseline function without conscious involvement. Query-initiated mode requires specific conditions but provides direct access to repository wisdom. When you consciously formulate a question before sleep, hold it clearly in awareness during the transition to unconsciousness, and maintain stable 8-hour sleep, the repository processes that query specifically and returns targeted insights. This is why sleeping on a problem actually works. Not because rest improves thinking, but because conscious query initiation allows the repository to search 200,000 years of accumulated human experience for relevant solutions. You wake with sudden clarity not because your individual brain solved the problem overnight, but because the repository found historical precedents and downloaded applicable strategies. Sarah had experienced this countless times, struggling with research problems, going to sleep frustrated, waking with clear solutions. So conscious repository queries are possible for anyone. Yes, but success requires 3 conditions. First, proper 8-hour sleep with minimal interruption. The query response cycle needs full protocol duration. Second, clean electromagnetic environment. Interference corrupts not just automatic uploads but query-specific downloads even more severely. Third, clear query formulation before sleep. Vague questions produce vague responses. Historically, cultures developed practices facilitating conscious repository access without understanding the mechanism. Indigenous dreamwork traditions, monastic dream incubation, shamanic journeying, these are all culturally specific frameworks for query-initiated repository access. The common elements across all traditions: sleep preparation rituals creating mental clarity, sleeping environments chosen for minimal disturbance, morning practices for recording and interpreting downloads. Different cultural language describing the same fundamental process: conscious interfacing with the collective wisdom repository. The being transmitted something that resonated with Sarah's research. And here's what modern sleep science has lost: understanding that dreams aren't random neural noise but information delivery systems. The bizarre imagery, impossible scenarios, emotional intensity, these aren't meaningless. They're encoding mechanisms. Repository downloads information at quantum level, pure data without narrative structure. Your consciousness receives this data during REM sleep and encodes it into memorable narrative formats, dreams. The strangeness of dream logic isn't dysfunction but efficient encoding. Bizarre imagery creates stronger memory anchors than realistic scenarios. This is why important dreams feel different from ordinary dreams. High-significance repository downloads generate more vivid, emotionally intense, narratively coherent dreams. Your consciousness recognizes important information and encodes it more carefully. Throughout human history, societies honored significant dreams as wisdom sources, not superstition but accurate recognition that some dreams carry genuine insight. The repository was sending important downloads, and culturally developed dream interpretation frameworks helped decode the symbolic encoding back into actionable wisdom. Sarah thought of her own vivid dreams, especially during periods of major life decisions. So dream analysis has legitimate function: decoding repository downloads. Correct, though modern dream interpretation often misses the mark by focusing too heavily on Freudian psychological symbolism. Useful dreams aren't primarily about your unconscious conflicts, though those exist and process during sleep too. Useful dreams are primarily repository downloads using symbolism for efficient encoding. Better approach: when you have a particularly vivid, emotionally significant dream, ask not what does this symbolize about my psyche, but rather what problem was I holding in consciousness before sleep, and what insight might this dream imagery represent about that problem. The repository answers specific queries with specific information. If you went to sleep thinking about a relationship conflict, a vivid dream about navigation challenges might represent downloaded insight about communication strategies. Pathfinding as metaphor for finding conversational approaches that work. If you went to sleep pondering career decisions, a dream about choosing between paths might represent repository feedback about decision frameworks that served other humans well in similar circumstances. The being transmitted practical protocols. To optimize conscious repository access, 1 hour before sleep, clearly formulate your query. Write it down. Read it aloud. Visualize yourself receiving clear guidance. This primes consciousness for query initiation. Eliminate electromagnetic interference near sleeping area. No smartphones within 3 meters. No Wi-Fi routers in bedroom. No LED lights with electronic drivers. Create the cleanest possible electromagnetic environment for quantum coherence. Maintain strict 8-hour sleep minimum. Set an alarm if necessary, but prioritize the full duration. Repository query response cycles need complete protocol time. Upon waking, immediately record dreams before memory degrades. Don't analyze yet, just document. Later in the day, when conscious mind is active, review dream records and look for thematic connections to your pre-sleep query. The insights are there, encoded symbolically. This practice, done consistently for 30 days, dramatically improves decision-making quality. You're literally consulting 200,000 years of accumulated human wisdom for every major life decision. not guaranteeing perfect outcomes, but substantially improving your odds of choosing strategies that work. The being's communication shifted tone, becoming more urgent. Dr. Chen, you now understand the individual mechanics of sleep protocol and repository access. But you must also understand the species-level crisis this interference is creating. Humanity evolved as a networked consciousness. Individual humans are nodes in a larger integrated system. The repository isn't just a passive database. It actively maintains species coherence by ensuring all nodes receive compatible operating instructions. When repository connection degrades across significant population percentages, humanity begins fragmenting into incompatible consciousness clusters. Groups that no longer share fundamental perceptual frameworks, ethical assumptions, or decision-making processes. This is already happening. You observe it as political polarization, cultural fragmentation, increasing inability for different population groups to communicate effectively. The root cause is repository disconnection. Groups sleeping in high-interference environments, averaging less than 6 hours, with chronically degraded sleep quality. These populations lose access to shared coherence downloads. Without nightly repository feedback, their consciousness development diverges from human historical norms. They are still human biologically, but their consciousness architecture starts operating on incompatible protocols. They develop values, perceptions, and reasoning patterns that other humans find incomprehensible, not because of bad faith but because literal cognitive divergence from repository-maintained coherence. Sarah saw the implications cascading. Social fragmentation as a sleep public health crisis. Exactly. Your sociologists study polarization as ideology. Your political scientists study it as power dynamics. The underlying mechanism is biological. Sleep deprivation-induced repository disconnection creating cognitive divergence. The solution isn't political. You can't argue people into coherence. The solution is biological. Restore proper sleep quality, eliminate electromagnetic interference, reconnect populations to the repository, and coherence naturally re-establishes. Historical precedent supports this. Throughout human history, periods of major civilizational stress correlate with sleep disruption. Wars, famines, plagues, all create chronic sleep deprivation across populations. And these periods show increased social fragmentation, extremist ideologies, breakdowns in moral restraint. Not because stress makes people evil, but because chronic sleep deprivation disconnects populations from repository coherence protocols. Without nightly error correction, cognitive distortions compound. Without collective wisdom downloads, groups reinvent ethics from first principles and arrive at incompatible frameworks. Modern crisis is unique because interference is chronic and widespread rather than acute and localized. Previous periods of sleep disruption were temporary. War ended, famine resolved, plague passed, sleep quality restored, repository connection re-established, coherence gradually rebuilt. But electromagnetic interference is permanent and intensifying. Each year, more devices, higher interference density, degrading sleep quality becoming environmental constant rather than temporary crisis. If this continues uninterrupted, repository disconnection becomes permanent species condition. The being transmitted terrifying projections. Timeline, at current degradation rate, 2032 is the critical threshold. That year, repository connection drops below 60%. After that, insufficient nodes maintain stable connection to sustain species-wide coherence. Humanity fragments into consciousness clusters, high sleep quality populations maintaining repository connection versus low sleep quality populations operating on divergent cognitive frameworks. The two groups become mutually incomprehensible, not through language barriers but through fundamental perceptual incompatibility. 2040s. Fragmented consciousness clusters begin treating each other as separate species. Empathy fails because repository-maintained shared humanity recognition breaks down. Conflicts intensify because groups literally cannot understand each other's reasoning processes. 2050s. Technological civilization collapses not through resource depletion or environmental catastrophe but through coordination failure. Complex societies require massive populations coordinating through shared assumptions and values. Fragmented consciousness cannot maintain that coordination. Infrastructure degrades, supply chains fail, specialized knowledge transmission breaks down. 2070s, last repository-connected generation dies. After that, no living humans maintain connection to collective wisdom. Humanity exists as disconnected individuals, each consciousness isolated, operating without access to 200,000 years of accumulated experience. Effective cognitive capacity reduced to single lifetime, exponentially more primitive than repository-connected ancestors. 2100s and beyond, humanity exists but does not progress. Each generation relearns basic lessons that repository-connected populations download automatically. Civilization stagnates at pre-industrial complexity levels because advanced coordination requires repository-mediated coherence. Sarah felt horror at the clinical precision of this civilizational death prediction. Is this inevitable? Or can the trajectory reverse? Reversible until 2032. After that, increasingly difficult. The intervention window is 8 years. Within that window, 3 things must happen. First, global awareness of the interference problem. Populations must understand that electromagnetic devices are degrading sleep quality through specific frequency interference. This requires research publication, media communication, public education, your expertise. Second, engineering modifications to emission profiles. Billions of devices must be updated to minimize radiation in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band during nighttime hours. This requires industry cooperation, regulatory incentives, consumer demand, achievable if awareness exists. Third, cultural revaluation of sleep. Societies must stop treating 8-hour sleep as luxury and recognize it as biological necessity for consciousness maintenance. This requires overturning sleep is for the weak cultural narratives and implementing systemic changes supporting proper sleep duration. None of these are technically impossible. All are achievable within 8 years if humanity prioritizes them. But priority requires awareness, and awareness requires credible voices communicating the crisis. Scientists like you, Dr. Chen. Sarah stood in her bedroom, EEG equipment still recording, facing an impossible being delivering information that should be dismissed as hallucination but felt undeniably real. Why me specifically? Why not contact political leaders, technology executives, someone with direct power to implement changes? Because those leaders won't believe without scientific validation. I could appear to them, explain everything I've told you, and they would dismiss it as hallucination, psychotic break, or elaborate deception. They're trained in power politics, not scientific methodology. They don't have frameworks for evaluating evidence of this nature. You are different. You're a scientist. You understand how to test hypotheses, evaluate evidence, communicate findings through peer-reviewed channels. You have sleep research data already demonstrating the patterns I've described. You can investigate microtool quantum coherence, analyze electromagnetic interference correlations, document repository connection degradation, all using existing scientific methods. Your research will provide the validation that makes this credible to other scientists, who will replicate and expand your findings, which will eventually reach policymakers with sufficient credibility to drive systemic changes. This is how paradigm shifts occur in your species. Not through top-down mandates but through bottom-up empirical validation. I'm contacting you because you're positioned at the critical node, the researcher with data, methodology, and communication platform to initiate the validation cascade. Sarah's scientific skepticism wrestled with mounting evidence. And if I choose not to publish? If I dismiss this as elaborate hallucination and continue standard sleep research? Then humanity continues its current trajectory. Another researcher might stumble upon the quantum coherence signatures eventually, but possibly not within the 8-year intervention window. The probability of species-wide consciousness fragmentation increases substantially. But I cannot force your choice. The repository protocol itself is built on free will. Forced consciousness modification would violate the fundamental principle that makes the system work. You must choose freely whether to investigate this information or dismiss it. The being transmitted something personal. I will tell you one additional factor in your decision. Your chronic insomnia these past 6 weeks, it's not random biological dysfunction. It's your consciousness attempting to signal alert to your waking awareness. At some unconscious level, your repository connection has been detecting the degradation patterns in global sleep data. During your nightly uploads, you've been accessing information about species-wide consciousness fragmentation. Your deeper awareness recognized the crisis. But that information couldn't reach conscious awareness through normal download processes because you were skeptical of anything not fitting materialist neuroscience frameworks. So your consciousness generated insomnia, forcing you awake at 2:47 a.m. repeatedly, creating desperation that made you willing to attach EEG equipment and document the experience. This encounter was orchestrated not by me but by your own deeper consciousness engineering circumstances where you'd be receptive to information you'd normally dismiss. I'm simply the messenger providing explanatory framework for what your consciousness already knew. Sarah recognized the pattern. How many breakthrough insights had come from sleep-deprived desperation making her consider ideas she'd normally reject. The quantum coherence enhancer you mentioned. Will you provide it now? The being gestured. A small device materialized on Sarah's nightstand. Silvery metallic, roughly cubic, approximately 5 centimeters on each side. Place this near your bed before sleep. It generates a localized electromagnetic null field in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band within 3-meter radius. Your repository connection will restore to optimal quality within 3 consecutive 8-hour sleep cycles. Use these 3 nights to experience the difference firsthand. Proper 8-hour sleep in clean electromagnetic environment, with full repository connection. You'll wake with clarity you haven't experienced in months. That experimental validation will provide personal motivation for the research ahead. After 3 nights, begin your investigation. Analyze existing sleep lab data for quantum coherence signatures. Design studies measuring electromagnetic interference correlations. Document everything with rigorous methodology. I will not contact you again directly. This is not an ongoing relationship but a single informational transmission. But you will have access to repository downloads during sleep if you formulate clear queries before sleeping. Specific research questions, experimental design challenges, publication strategies, query the repository, and relevant insights will download. The being began dematerializing, not dramatically but gradually, presence fading like mist dissipating. Remember, Dr. Sarah Chen. Humanity has 8 years to restore sleep quality and repository connection. After 2032, fragmentation becomes irreversible within any reasonable timeline. The choice to prevent it begins with your choice tonight. Investigate this information or dismiss it. Choose wisely. The future of species-wide consciousness coherence depends substantially on this single decision. And the being was gone. Complete silence. Ordinary bedroom atmosphere. Sarah alone with EEG equipment still recording, a strange metallic device on her nightstand, and a decision that felt simultaneously impossible and unavoidable. She looked at the EEG equipment. Hours of brain wave data recorded. If this had been hallucination, the recordings would show psychotic patterns. If it had been real, the recordings would show impossible coherence, consciousness maintaining clarity while brain waves indicated deep sleep. The evidence was there. She just had to analyze it. Sarah made her decision. 3 nights later, Sarah sat in her Stanford laboratory analyzing data with hands that trembled slightly from excitement and residual skepticism warring inside her mind. The EEG recordings from the encounter night showed exactly what the being had predicted. Consciousness maintaining coherent awareness while brain activity demonstrated stage 3 deep sleep. Impossible under standard neuroscience models. Undeniable in the empirical data. But that wasn't all. The 3 subsequent nights using the quantum coherence enhancer had been revelatory. 8 hours of stable, deep, restorative sleep for the first time in 6 weeks. She'd woken each morning with clarity, energy, and most strikingly, insights about her research that seemed to arrive fully formed rather than laboriously constructed. The 3rd morning, She'd awakened with complete understanding of how to search her laboratory's historical data for quantum coherence signatures. Specific mathematical transforms to apply, particular frequency bands to analyze, statistical methods for correlating interference levels with sleep quality metrics. She'd spent the previous 48 hours implementing that analysis across 7 years of sleep study data. 1,847 subjects, 23,441 individual sleep sessions, millions of data points. The patterns were undeniable. Strong correlation between electromagnetic interference density and sleep quality degradation. R equals -0.74, P less than 0.001. Subjects sleeping in electromagnetically shielded rooms showed 340% better deep sleep duration than subjects in high-interference environments. Quantum coherence signatures during stage 3 sleep, exactly as predicted. Weak but coherent electromagnetic oscillations in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band, strongest during delta wave sleep, fluctuating in patterns that matched theoretical quantum entanglement models. Most compelling, subjects with stronger coherence signatures during sleep demonstrated measurably better decision-making performance on cognitive tests the following day. The correlation was moderate but highly significant. R equals 0.52, P less than 0.001. Sarah was looking at empirical evidence that something beyond classical neural activity was happening during sleep. Evidence rigorous enough to publish. She drafted the paper carefully over the next 3 weeks. Title: Quantum Coherence Signatures During Stage 3 Sleep, Evidence for Non-Classical Information Processing. Focus on empirical findings, correlational data, testable predictions. Theoretical framework presented as proposed mechanism, not proven fact. Submission to Nature Neuroscience. Brutal peer review. 3 rounds of revisions. Skeptical reviewers demanding additional controls, alternative explanations, replication with independent datasets. Sarah provided everything. Invited other sleep labs to analyze their historical data using the mathematical transforms she'd developed. 4 laboratories confirmed the quantum coherence signatures in their own datasets. Replication across independent samples, different countries, different equipment. 6 months after the encounter, her paper was accepted. Published with cautious title and rigorous methodology, but the evidence was there. Something beyond classical neuroscience was happening during human sleep. Media attention was immediate and divided. Scientific community split between fascination and skepticism. Technology journalists connecting her findings to electromagnetic interference concerns. Public health advocates calling for investigation into sleep-disrupting environmental factors. Sarah's laboratory received funding for a massive 5-year study, 50,000 subjects across 23 countries, systematically documenting sleep quality, electromagnetic interference levels, cognitive performance, and quantum coherence signatures. 18 months after the encounter, preliminary results from the expanded study confirmed everything at larger scale. Electromagnetic interference in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band was directly disrupting sleep quality. Populations in high-interference environments showed degraded cognitive performance that improved significantly when interference was reduced. Technology companies began paying attention. Not from altruism but from market pressure. Consumers demanded sleep-safe devices. Engineers started modifying emission profiles, filtering out unnecessary radiation in the critical frequency band. Regulatory agencies proposed guidelines. No electromagnetic emissions above specified thresholds in the 0.5 to 4 Hz band during nighttime hours. Industry resisted initially, but consumer demand and mounting evidence made compliance economically advantageous. 3 years after the encounter, Sarah could document measurable improvement in population-level sleep quality. Countries implementing strict electromagnetic standards showed 12 to 18% improvement in average sleep efficiency within 18 months. But the deeper research continued. Sarah and a growing network of consciousness researchers were investigating the repository hypothesis directly. Could they provide empirical evidence for a collective unconscious database that individuals accessed during sleep? The approach was ingenious. If the repository exists and contains accumulated human experiences, individuals should be able to access information during sleep that they have no individual explanation for knowing. Experimental design. Teach subjects a complex problem-solving strategy. Let them sleep 8 hours with optimal electromagnetic environment and quantum coherence enhancers. Then test their understanding of related but distinct problem-solving strategies never explicitly taught. Results. Subjects demonstrated understanding of related strategies at rates significantly above chance, even when those strategies were novel creations never published or taught to anyone. The only plausible explanation: they were accessing solution patterns from the repository that represented accumulated human problem-solving wisdom. The paradigm was shifting. Not quickly, not uniformly, but inexorably. Sleep was being reconceptualized from passive recovery period to active maintenance protocol for consciousness itself. 5 years after the encounter, Sarah presented keynote address at the International Sleep Research Conference. Title: Sleep as Consciousness Maintenance, Evidence for Information Exchange Beyond Individual Neural Processing. Standing before 2,300 sleep researchers from 67 countries, Sarah presented the accumulated evidence. Quantum coherence during sleep. Electromagnetic interference correlations. Problem-solving performance improvements. Cross-cultural dream pattern similarities suggesting shared information access. The question-and-answer session ran 90 minutes beyond schedule. Skeptics challenged methodology. Supporters proposed extensions. Everyone recognized they were witnessing potential paradigm shift. That night, Sarah returned to her hotel room exhausted but fulfilled. She placed her quantum coherence enhancer on the nightstand. She carried it everywhere now, unwilling to sleep without optimal repository connection. Before sleep, she formulated a clear query, as had become her nightly practice: what remains to be discovered about the repository protocol? What should my research focus on next? 8 hours later, she woke with an insight that would shape the next decade of her work. The repository wasn't just passive database. It was developing, learning, evolving in response to humanity's collective experiences. Every human who uploaded experiences during sleep was contributing to repository growth. And the repository was using that accumulated data to generate increasingly sophisticated guidance for species development. Humanity wasn't just accessing ancient wisdom. We were collectively building ever more refined wisdom through every person's nightly contribution. Sarah smiled, grabbed her research notebook, and began documenting the insight. The work had barely begun. 8 years after Sarah's initial encounter, the 2032 threshold approached. The critical year when repository connection would either stabilize or collapse below recovery threshold. Global sleep quality had improved dramatically. Electromagnetic standards implemented in 94 countries. Technology manufacturers redesigning devices for minimal sleep interference. Public health campaigns emphasizing 8-hour sleep importance. Most significantly, cultural attitudes had shifted. Sleep was no longer dismissed as weakness but recognized as biological necessity for cognitive function. Schools implementing later start times. Corporations offering sleep optimization programs. Architecture incorporating electromagnetic shielding in residential bedroom designs. Sarah's research network now spanned 340 laboratories worldwide, coordinating the largest consciousness study in human history. Real-time monitoring of repository connection quality across representative population samples. The data updated monthly. January 2032, 62.3% of monitored population maintaining stable repository connection during sleep. February, 63.1%. March, 64.7%. The trajectory had reversed. Humanity was reconnecting. But Sarah knew the work was far from complete. 65% connection rate was stable but not optimal. Historical baseline was 89%. Reaching that required continued effort, ongoing electromagnetic discipline, sustained cultural prioritization of sleep. She was 42 years old now. 8 years of relentless research, publication, advocacy. Transformed from sleep researcher to consciousness researcher to, improbably, spokesperson for humanity's nightly connection to collective wisdom. The work had cost her. Relationships strained by obsessive research focus. Personal health neglected in pursuit of species-level crisis resolution. But she'd done it. Humanity had listened. The fragmentation had been prevented. One quiet evening, Sarah sat in her backyard under night sky, holding the quantum coherence enhancer the being had given her 8 years ago. It still worked perfectly. She'd reverse-engineered it, published the schematics, enabled mass production. Millions of people now used similar devices. She wondered if the being was observing, watching to see if humanity had chosen reconnect ion over fragmentation. If the intervention had succeeded. No dramatic appearance this time. No telepathic communication. Just ordinary night, ordinary silence, and Sarah's consciousness knowing, at some level deeper than rational thought, that the message had been received. Humanity had been given information, tools, and choice. We'd chosen to investigate rather than dismiss, to change rather than continue, to reconnect rather than fragment. The repository protocol was stabilizing. Species-wide consciousness coherence was rebuilding. The 8-year intervention window had been sufficient. Sarah closed her eyes, formulating her nightly query with deep gratitude. Thank you for trusting us with this knowledge. We heard. We acted. We're reconnecting. What comes next? That night, she slept 8 perfect hours. Deep, restorative, coherent. And in her dreams, she received an answer. Not words but understanding, flowing from the repository directly into her consciousness. Images of humanity's future, not just surviving but thriving, not just avoiding catastrophe but achieving potential. Populations maintaining healthy repository connection. Children growing up with stable access to collective wisdom. Technologies designed in harmony with consciousness rather than conflict. Civilizations coordinating through shared coherence. And beyond that, humanity eventually understanding the repository so thoroughly that conscious access became commonplace. Not just nocturnal downloads but waking connection to accumulated wisdom whenever needed. The repository itself evolving, incorporating not just human experiences but beginning to interface with repositories from other species across the galaxy. Humanity joining a larger network of consciousness, contributing our unique experiences while learning from others. The vision wasn't certain future but possible future. Trajectory if humanity continued prioritizing consciousness maintenance, valuing sleep, minimizing interference, choosing connection over isolation. Sarah woke at dawn, the vision still vivid. She grabbed her notebook and began writing, knowing this would be her next research direction. Conscious waking repository access. Teaching people to query collective wisdom during daily life, not just during sleep. The work would take decades. But that was fine. She had time. Humanity had time. We'd chosen to use it wisely. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you're someone who senses there's more to sleep than conventional understanding acknowledges. Someone who's felt, perhaps, that those 8 hours serve purposes beyond physical rest. You're right to trust that intuition. Everything described in this account is rooted in emerging research at the frontiers of consciousness science, quantum biology, and sleep neuroscience. The quantum coherence signatures during deep sleep, real phenomenon, documented in peer-reviewed journals. The electromagnetic interference affecting sleep quality, measured effect with growing evidence base. The correlation between sleep quality and cognitive performance, established scientific consensus. What remains theoretical is the mechanism, the repository concept, the species-wide consciousness network, the nightly upload-download protocol. But the empirical patterns pointing towards something like this are undeniable. Consider your own experience. How many times have you woken with sudden solutions to problems that seemed unsolvable the night before? How often do properly rested decisions prove wiser than exhausted choices? Why does chronic sleep deprivation degrade not just energy but personality, judgment, empathy, your very sense of self? The conventional explanation is neurochemical recovery, memory consolidation, toxin clearance. All true but potentially incomplete. What if sleep serves functions we're only beginning to discover? The invitation isn't to believe uncritically. It's to investigate personally. Try this. For the next 30 days, prioritize 8-hour sleep with obsessive discipline. Create the darkest, quietest, most electromagnetically clean bedroom environment possible. Remove devices, shield interference, honor the full duration. Before sleep each night, formulate one clear question, not trivial but genuinely important to your life. Hold it in awareness as you drift toward unconsciousness. Record your dreams immediately upon waking. Look for thematic connections to your pre-sleep queries. Notice changes in decision quality, emotional regulation, problem-solving clarity, relational empathy. If nothing changes, you've lost nothing but gained excellent sleep. If something does change, if you notice improvements that seem disproportionate to simple rest, perhaps there's more to investigate. The 8-hour requirement isn't arbitrary. Whether the mechanism is quantum repository connection or complex neurochemical processes we don't yet fully understand, the empirical evidence is clear. 8 hours of quality sleep fundamentally changes consciousness function. Humanity is rediscovering this ancient wisdom. Not through mysticism but through rigorous science finally sophisticated enough to detect what traditional cultures always knew. Sleep is sacred. Those 8 hours are humanity's nightly communion with something larger than individual awareness. Protect them. Honor them. Use them wisely. Your consciousness will thank you. And possibly, in ways we're only beginning to understand, humanity's collective consciousness will evolve because you chose to maintain your connection. The repository awaits. Every night. In the dark. In the silence. In the 8-hour window where you stop being isolated individual and temporarily rejoin the species-wide network. Sleep well. Upload completely. Download wisely. The future depends substantially on whether humanity chooses to reconnect. One consciousness at a time. One 8-hour cycle at a time. Starting tonight.